It has become a platitude to declare that you want to change the world, that you want to make it a better place. Let me introduce to you someone who didn't operate by declaring such platitudes, but rather, through a posture of humility and undaunted persistence, did indeed change the world in fundamental ways for the better. More than just learn his story, we can look at the patterns of how he did so, to aid us in our own efforts to bring about fundamental change. If you have heard of William Wilberforce, it's likely because you saw the movie Amazing Grace, released some 15-odd years ago and based on an even better book that highlighted Wilberforce's efforts to end the British slave trade. And indeed, this was a titanic accomplishment in a world where slavery was and had been a normal and accepted part of human affairs from time immemorial. Unbeknownst to many, he, with a small group of Christian zealots in Great Britain, did even more than that. They also were successful in bringing about fundamental reforms in British societal practices that were commonplace before their efforts, such as rampant capital punishment for crimes that would be considered minor today, prostitution and child prostitution, animal competition such as bull baiting, where bulldogs would literally be allowed to tear a live bull apart, and rampant alcoholism that had reached epidemic proportions. It strains our minds to conceive, but before Wilberforce, such treatment of human beings and animals was commonplace and accepted, but after Wilberforce, it quickly became unthinkable. And herein lies Wilberforce's greatest achievement, catalyzing a fundamental shift in human perceptions and paradigms that had stood for millennia. So what can we learn from Wilberforce and how such shifts are achieved, whether in our own lives, our families, or our communities? The first thing to observe about Wilberforce is that all that he accomplished had its origins and energy from a fundamental system of values. Wilberforce didn't always care about the causes that would come to define him, but after becoming a young member of British Parliament in his early 20s, he experienced a dramatic Christian conversion through intense spiritual conversations with a friend while vacationing in the French countryside. He would never be the same thereafter. And having established this connection with the divine, he became one of the rare individuals who didn't just assent to the propositions of Christianity, but who embodied them zealously for the rest of his life. Foremost among these being that Judeo-Christian teaching found in the opening chapters of Genesis, that all humanity bears the image of God, which suggests not so much the equality of all human beings, but the inestimable worth of every human and every human group. In that value alone, you can understand the actions, thoughts, and positions found in the rest of the hours and days that composed his beautiful life. It is our values that then drive the nature of our goals and priorities. In the zeal of his conversion, Wilberforce initially assumed that he would need to leave Parliament in order to focus on a life of service to God. But wise individuals advising him at the time helped him to realize that his position gave him a unique opportunity to live his values through establishing goals at the level of a nation and empire. From this perspective, his path became obvious. He was to work the rest of his life to accomplish two great causes or goals: the end of slavery and the reformation of manners, which meant the abolishment of those inhumane societal practices mentioned previously. With a system of values in place, which then defined his goals, it is perhaps the last aspect in the process of becoming that Wilberforce can teach us the most about. And this is the category of what we here at Ampelis call meaningful intentions. The reality of any kind of fundamental change or fundamental progress that we want to bring about is that they do not come quickly or easily, and it is impossible to see at first all the actions and efforts which will be required to bring them about. Wilberforce's story reinforces this perfectly. From the time that he decided to pursue the abolishment of the slave trade to the time that the slave trade was actually abolished was over 2 decades of persistent effort. And that just ended the slave trade. From that time to the abolishment of slavery and the emancipation of the slaves in the West Indies was another couple decades, with Wilberforce dying just a few days after he received word of the event he'd been seeking most of his life. And so what lies between the establishment of a significant goal and the accomplishment of that goal long in the future are countless acts and efforts of meaningful intentions, the incremental actions, oftentimes small and seed-like, sometimes large, that move toward the goal and begin to organically cultivate the conditions that will make the final accomplishment of the goal possible at some point in time. Wilberforce and his friends were masters of meaningful intentions. When they started, British society was against them, Parliament was against them, and the economics of the slave trade was against them. So they took the actions that they could as soon as they could. They moved to live near each other to synergize their efforts. They networked unceasingly within society to find any public figure that could add appeal to the cause. They gathered as much data and testimony as they could from witnesses in the slave trade and began presenting this data in whatever formats and venues they could. They gathered signatures of their supporters to present their show of numbers. Wilberforce would present the bill in Parliament to abolish the slave trade every year, regardless of its chances to pass, to send the message that this movement had nothing to do with prudence or convenience, but came from a fundamental stance of right and wrong. The list of incremental actions they took over the years is breathtaking. And year after year, the measure fell, sometimes coming right up to the margin of passage and then failing to pass. Discouraged but not undaunted, they also worked on the other moral issues that could pass at the moment, where they found any seemingly innocuous regulation they could get passed that would make the slave trade even slightly more difficult or expensive for its merchants, eliminating even small percentages of participants, and thus human lives. When the French Revolution began and war was threatening from France, the abolition movement became associated with the possibility of revolution in England, and so the tide turned entirely against the abolitionists, and yet still they maintained their position. Still, Wilberforce presented the bill, continuing the preparation of the deeper soil of abolition, even while the surface soil had grown hard and infertile. Certainly the movement benefited from another principle we like to call the time value of change, based off of the time value of money, which says that because of compound interest, money invested today will end up being worth magnitudes more than money invested next month or next year. And so it is with change, with meaningful intentions put in action today bearing much more fruit than those sowed later on. No war lasts forever, and finally, with the countless meaningful intentions sowed and groundwork laid, the threat from France ended, and some arbitrary changes came about in the makeup in Parliament that would work to the abolitionists' favor. And so the moment came quite suddenly when abolition went from an impossibility to a foregone conclusion. But only because the soil for abolition was tilled, weeded, watered, fertilized, and planted through 2 decades of intentions, and now the field sprung to life and fruition at the first sunlight of a new dawn. At the celebration in Parliament upon passage that day, a member of Parliament compared 2 great men of the time, Napoleon and Wilberforce, and contrasted how one was great because he had sowed the seeds of war through his intentions and brought about the death and destruction of countless lives, whereas the other one had sown intentions and seeds of peace and saved the lives of millions. That we know so much about one of these men and so little of the other is a problem that will be rectified when the real history of the world is told. May we learn more of this great man, Wilberforce, and follow the patterns he embodied for how to truly make the world a better place.